At harvest, 13-year-old Caleb Brooks stood beside a wooden sorting table while his father cut open 2 apples from the same row. The first looked nearly perfect from the outside. Its red skin was smooth, and only a tiny brown mark showed near the blossom end. But when David Brooks pushed the knife through the center, a dark tunnel appeared inside. The seeds were damaged, the flesh had turned brown, and a pale lava curled near the core. The second apple was slightly lighter in color. Until a few weeks earlier, it had spent most of the summer hidden inside a small brown paper bag. David opened it. The flesh was clean. The seeds were whole. There was no tunnel. The neighbor who had laughed at Caleb's trees stopped talking. If you enjoy quiet stories about farming, patience, and people who solve problems with simple ideas, subscribe and join us. Sometimes the strongest protection in a field is not made of steel, chemicals, or expensive machinery. Several months earlier, the Brooks orchard in Cache County, Utah, had looked ridiculous from the road. Caleb stood on a short orchard ladder, fastening small paper bags around young green apples. He cut a narrow opening along the top edge, guided the stem through it, and folded the paper carefully without squeezing the branch. Hundreds of brown bags hung from the trees. Workers from a neighboring orchard stopped beside the fence. One pointed at Caleb and laughed, "Packing lunch for every apple." Another man said the trees looked as though they were growing paper socks. Caleb kept a calm, thoughtful expression. He checked the stem, adjusted the fold, and reached for the next bag. His father had more practical concerns. The orchard held thousands of developing apples. Covering every fruit would take too long. Wind could tear the paper. Rain could soak it. A tight fold might damage the stem, while a loose one could leave space for insects. Caleb did not propose covering the entire orchard. He selected a few rows, marked untreated trees for comparison, and tied colored thread near every protected cluster. He was not hiding apples from sunlight. He was placing a wall between the fruit and something small enough to enter through a hole no wider than a pencil point. The Brooks family orchard was small enough that every crate mattered. David sold most of the apples through local markets and a roadside stand. Fruit with minor surface marks could still be used for cider or preserves, but apples containing larvae could not be placed in the fresh market. The previous season had been especially frustrating. Many apples appeared healthy through early summer. Then small holes began forming near the blossom end or along the side. Brown crumbs gathered around the openings. Some fruit dropped before ripening. Other damage remained invisible until the apples were cut during sorting. Caleb began examining the fallen fruit. He noticed that the insect did not remain on the surface. A moth-laden egg near a young apple. After hatching, the larva searched for the fruit and entered quickly. Once inside, it fed toward the seed cavity, protected from anything applied only to the outer skin. By the time a farmer saw the hole, the important damage had already happened. Caleb found an old home orchard guide in a cabinet beside his grandmother Ruth's gardening books. It described covering selected fruit with small paper bags after thinning. The paper acted as a physical barrier, but timing was critical. If the fruit was covered after a larva had entered, the bag merely concealed the problem. Ruth remembered wrapping a few special pears when Caleb was younger. Her family had never protected an entire orchard that way. The work was too slow. But for exhibition fruit, gifts, or a few valuable trees, they sometimes guarded each piece individually. Caleb designed a simple comparison. One group of apples would remain uncovered. A second group would be bagged early, after weak fruit had dropped and clusters had been thinned. A third group would be covered later. Before adding the bags, Caleb removed the smallest apples from crowded clusters and left one strong fruit with enough space around it. He knew the method could not work if 2 apples pressed against the same paper or if a damaged fruit was protected by mistake. His father watched him separate the groups. "What are you trying to prove?" David asked. "Not only whether the bags work," Caleb said. "I want to know when they stop being useful." A paper wall could keep a larva out. It could not remove one that was already inside. Caleb's first group of bags created more trouble than protection. He began before the weakest fruit had finished dropping naturally. Several small apples fell within days, carrying the bags with them. The grass beneath the trees became scattered with brown paper. He had folded other bags too tightly. As the fruit stems moved in the wind, The paper rubbed against them. A few stems bent sharply near the fold. One apple remained hanging only because the bag had caught on a twig after the stem broke. Then rain arrived. Water entered several poorly folded bags and collected near the bottom. The wet paper clung to the fruit. When Caleb opened those bags, he found damp spots and early skin discoloration. The next windstorm was worse. Thin paper split on the exposed western side of the orchard. Some bags tore open like small flags. Others disappeared completely and collected against the fence. David walked through the damaged section with Caleb. "This only works if the protection survives longer than the pest," he said. Caleb nodded. His father was right. He studied every failed bag and changed the method. He waited until the trees had shed their weakest fruit. He thinned crowded clusters more carefully. Instead of folding the paper tightly against the stem, he left room for movement. He made tiny drainage openings near the lower corners so rainwater could escape. On the windy side of the orchard, he replaced the thinnest bags with stronger paper. He also moved slowly enough to check each apple for marks before covering it. Ruth helped him build a simple moth monitoring trap. It would not protect the fruit by itself. It would only show when adult moth activity increased. Caleb hung the trap among the trees and checked it each morning. For several days, he found nothing. Then one warm morning, a small grey moth rested inside. 2 more appeared after another mild night. Caleb began inspecting the bags daily. He replaced torn ones, removed fallen apples, and marked every fruit that had been covered late. The neighbors continued pointing at the trees and laughing about paper lunches. Caleb no longer cared. The real test had begun after sunset, when the moths moved quietly between the branches and searched for places to leave their eggs. By midsummer, the night stayed warm long after sunset. Each morning, Caleb found more moths in the monitoring trap. Soon, the first signs appeared on unprotected fruit. A tiny opening formed near the end of one apple. Brown material clung to the skin around it. David picked the fruit, cut it open, and followed the tunnel toward the seeds. The larva was already deep inside. On the untreated trees, damage increased gradually. Not every apple was affected, but each week brought more holes, more fallen fruit, and more internal tunnels. The late-bagged group produced mixed results. Some apples remained clean. Others looked protected from the outside but contained larvae that had entered before Caleb covered them. One bag held an apple with no visible hole until David opened it and found the center damaged. The early bagged group performed better. Moths could land on the paper. Eggs could be left near the folds. But newly hatched larvae had difficulty reaching the apple skin when the bag remained sealed and intact. The method was not perfect. Wind reopened several folds. Earwigs entered one loose bag and sheltered beside the fruit. Ants moved through another. Moisture marked a few apple skins. Some fruit had been damaged before Caleb noticed any sign. Caleb recorded every failure. He separated torn bags from late bags. He marked fruit with moisture damage and fruit lost after poor fastening. He refused to count every covered apple as a success. After a violent night wind, dozens of bags hung open. David found Caleb replacing them before breakfast. Without saying anything, he picked up a bundle of fresh bags and began working on the next tree. It was the first morning they repaired the experiment together. By then, the paper had already answered one question. Applied early and maintained carefully, it could reduce access to the fruit. But another problem remained. The covered apples were receiving less light. Red varieties needed exposure near ripening to develop good color. If Caleb removed the bags too early, he could open the fruit during another period of moth activity. If he waited too long, the apples might remain pale and sell poorly. The final decision was no longer whether to remove the paper. It was when. Several weeks before harvest, Caleb opened the bags around part of the early protected group. The apples beneath them looked strange. Their skins were pale compared with the deep red fruit growing in full sunlight. A neighbor standing near the fence pointed toward Caleb and laughed again. "You saved them from worms and forgot to let them become apples." Caleb said nothing. He left the fruit uncovered on the trees and continued checking it each morning. Slowly, the pale skins began to change. Warm days and sunlight brought red color across the exposed sides. At harvest, the family kept the group separate. The untreated trees still produced many good apples. The experiment had never suggested that every uncovered fruit would fail. But the sorting table also held a noticeable number with entry holes, damaged cores, and internal tunnels. The late-covered group showed only a modest improvement. Several apples had been bagged after larvae had already entered. The early-covered group produced the clearest difference. Most of the apples remained clean inside. Some were lighter in color. A few carried moisture marks. Several had been lost when bags tore, and a small number still contained damage. The method had not saved the entire orchard. Covering thousands of apples individually would require too much labor for the Brooks family. The bags needed inspection after rain and wind. Poor fastening created new problems. The method could not replace monitoring, thinning, orchard sanitation, or broader pest management. But on a few selected trees, around valuable fruit, or in a small home orchard, the result was useful. The neighbor visited while David and Caleb were sorting. He selected one apple from the early bagged group and cut it open. The flesh was clean. The seeds were undamaged. He studied the halves for a moment. "How big should the apple be before you cover it?" he asked. Caleb did not mention the jokes. He picked up a damaged apple from the late group and opened it beside the clean one. "The size matters," Caleb said, "but the timing matters more." This one was already occupied before the bag went on. The following spring, the Brooks family did not cover every apple. They chose a smaller number of strong trees, thinned the fruit carefully, and protected only the best apples at the correct stage. David improved the drainage cuts while Ruth prepared stronger bags for the windy rows. From the road, the orchard once again appeared to be growing hundreds of brown paper lunches. But no one in the family laughed. Caleb had not eliminated the moths. He had only learned that even a wall made of paper can be strong enough when it is placed before the enemy gets inside.